Hello everyone. It's Thursday and it's our smorgasbord day where we have different students and teachers and things on. And today we have a very interesting guest. Dizzy Zylestra is a student at the Moira Press and also just an astrologer of his own right. He has a lot of thoughts on gender in astrology, which were coming out kind of during class. And so we thought we need to have a full-on episode where we hear your ideas, Dizzy. So l- take it away.
Yeah, so I'm Dizzy. I practice astrology in Edmonton, which is Treaty 6 territory up in Canada, pretty far north for people who haven't been there. Um, and I take that seriously. I think the place that we are on grounds us. So I think I get this special opportunity to do astrology here and also learn from some of the Indigenous elders who live in this area. That said, so yeah, we've talked about masculinity and femininity in astrology in class a bit, and I think I wanted to start just by going over the basics for maybe people who haven't thought about it a ton. So I've written up some of it here. Uh, when we're talking about masculinity and femininity in astrology, it's very ancient, most of it. Obviously, we've had some of these new planets come out like Uranus and Neptune and Pluto. So that changes things up a bit. That's more modern knowledge. But when I put here masculine and feminine, that's very ancient. It's going back thousands of years. And that's something we share with, for example, Vedic astrologers. So for those who don't know, in masculine signs and planets, we've got Mars, the Sun, Saturn, and Jupiter. And we've got Aquarius, Aries, Gemini, Leo, Libra, and Sagittarius. Now, an interesting thing in ancient teachings is that Mercury is considered neutral. So it can generally it's just considered neutral, although some will say based on position, it becomes either masculine or feminine. Then for feminine signs and planets, we have Venus, the moon, Neptune, and Pluto. And we have Pisces, Cancer, Virgo, Scorpio, Capricorn, and Taurus. So that's just the basic ideas that the vast majority of astrologers, both now and in the past, would have agreed on. Uh, Now, where this started to interest me when I was going into it is I was looking at this, and what you'll notice is right now I just have this blank zodiac here. But if we started filling in the signs, what we would see is it would go masculine, feminine, masculine, feminine, masculine, feminine, right back and forth. I was like, oh, that's interesting, right? And if you look up at the sky and imagine this, you know, it seems as like bands of these energies going through. That said, I started to look at the basics of what made the signs, which was the elements. For those who haven't looked into the elements much, you have certain signs that are water signs, some that are fire, some that are earth, and some that are air. All these signs trine to each other, but the elements are also made up of two dimensions. Namely, they can either be hot and cold, or hot or cold, and they will be wet or dry. So water is a cold and wet element, fire being hot and dry, earth being cold and dry, and air being hot and wet. And this is where things started to get interesting because I realized that when I looked around, that masculine, feminine pattern I was seeing was also a hot, cold pattern. And this worked out very well. It's like, oh, wow, what am I seeing here? What is it that makes it so that masculine is always hot? Then I started playing with the aspects and realized that the most important dimension of the elements, of the signs in general, was whether or not they were hot or cold. This was what would drive their attraction or uh, repelling against each other, right? It would be that dissociation between hot and cold, that the modality of the sign mattered a bit, you know, cardinal, fixed, and mutable, and the wet and dry dimension also mattered a bit, but principally hot and cold mattered the most.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Interesting. So you're saying that all of the fire and air signs are masculine and hot, and then all of the earth and water signs are feminine and cold.
Correct.
Fascinating. I never put that connection together.
Yeah, I was pulling it apart to try and it actually came from I was learning French and then reading Stephen Forrest at the same time, and he mentioned at one point astrology being like a language. And I was like, oh, if it's a language, what's the alphabet? What's the grammar? What's the syntax? And this was pulling it apart and getting down to like, oh, elements and then the components of the elements. And yeah, then you see that this hot and cold dimension is what also defines the masculine and feminine,
Hmm.
right?
You're
And then
making
if
me
we
want
think
to read Ptolemy. The Tetrabiblos is
exactly.
all about hot, cold, wet, dry. Like it makes me want to go
Mhm.
back and look.
Right, right. And how were they playing with it? And granted, these are the ones that I have come across. There may be others who have slightly different interpretations of this. Like I'm not sure if everybody has agreed on the elements, but this is the elements and then the masculine and femininity and the neutrality of the planets and signs. That, as far as I've seen, that is fairly agreed upon within astrology and agreed upon for a long time. And to me, that's telling me there's something powerful there to be known.
Hmm.
Now, at the same time as I was doing this, I was also reading Louise Eddington and Alice Sparkley Cat. And Alice Sparkley Cat, actually, I've got her book here, their book here, Post-Colonial Astrology, which is actually really big on understanding the etymology of the planets, right? So if you go through this table of contents here, you'll get the etymology of the sun, the etymology of the moon, etymology of Saturn, and so on and so forth. And they do a great job of showing how, like, one of the things they do is look at gender within these, right? So, for example, the idea of a feminine moon and how different that was in Roman times versus now because of different societal ideas
Oh,
around femininity and masculinity. For instance, femininity was considered more material, while masculinity was considered more spiritual. So they mentioned, for example, the that poetry was considered masculine, while stonemasonry was considered feminine. Right?
interesting. Yeah.
Right. So in the etymology of the moon that they were explaining, there was a matter of the moon being associated with the market, for instance, and silver.
Okay.
Right. And so there's that interesting idea of like how we look at masculine and femininity. Femininity changes a lot based on the society we are within,
Oh,
right?
okay.
And what that society's ideas about masculinity and femininity are. And then there's another piece, and that's that most of these languages have masculine or feminine grammar, right? So, like I'm studying French, you have masculine and feminine words. You know, a table is feminine, so is a window. It doesn't have anything to do with them being male or female, but the language has that built in. And I believe Greek does as well, like ancient Greek.
Right. Yeah.
Something interesting to that though is I did ask around. I'm going to ask you about Greek, but I asked around, and in the languages I can identify, so French was one, and then I asked a friend about Sanskrit, about whether or not the masculinity or femininity based in astrology, whether or not that was also reflected in the language. And in French and Portuguese and Spanish and in Sanskrit, it doesn't.
Hmm.
As does it in ancient Greek?
So what's the question is
does
this
the does the grammatical gender in Greek of, for example, the planets and signs line up with the astrological significations of
oh,
masculinity and
interesting.
femininity?
Interesting.
So, for example, in French, there's only two feminine signs. It's Libra and Virgo, only one of which is actually a feminine
Oh,
sign.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I would have to do the research to actually go back and look at
Okay.
like is the word for Mars masculine? Is the word for Venus feminine? I think Aphrodite is a feminine word. It ends in an
Mhm.
eta. Aries, I think it is masculine. Aries is the word for Mars,
Mhm.
Aries. But yeah, I think it is masculine. But of course, I'd have to go back and look at all of them. That's a
Okay.
really good question. Yeah.
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 And in what I was told about Sanskrit was that in Sanskrit, the signs are feminine and the planets are masculine. And
Okay.
yet they still, in astrology, they separate them by masculine and feminine. And
Gotcha.
it's in the same way that we would within Western astrology. Although I'm not sure about the modern planets.
Wow.
And for those watching, that's something to keep in mind is that the modern planets, these are current ideas, but we should probably treat them with some care and be open to learning more because when we're talking about ancient ideas, we're talking about civilizations that lasted thousands of years testing these ideas and coming to an understanding that we can now have. With the modern ones, we just have a few hundred years of experience with them. We may not have totally figured them out yet.
Yeah, can I speak a little bit to the point you just made about culture and masculinity and femininity? So we have this culture and astrology series where we interface, the chart with the culture that the chart's inhabiting. And I think
Mhm.
it's a really interesting point you're making that the culture of a time period influences how masculinity and femininity is perceived. Like I would think of being a stonemason as very masculine, like picking up
Mhm.
stones but you're saying in this ancient time it was feminine. And so I think, or maybe I got that wrong.
In one particular culture,
Oh, and the one, okay. Well,
right?
I mean, and I think this is similar to the interplay of astrology and culture. Masculinity and femininity and culture, there's intersections there. And I like what you're saying there, that when we look at masculine and femininity, we have to look at it interwoven with the culture in which it's being,
Yes.
analyzed.
Yes. And that's part of why I've been like pulling this apart and thinking about it is I see, and maybe we'll jump to that. Why do I think this is important to talk about? Because I think that there is a problematic aspect to using the terms masculine and feminine to describe this energy in our particular culture at this particular time.
Okay.
So I think basically masculine and feminine are we're using a metaphor there, and it's a good one. I'm not saying it's a bad one. Just like for example, if you were from a different culture or had a different mindset, maybe yin yang would be what you would use. But to me, part of the issue here is that in this time and in this culture, there is a lot of strong feelings. There's a lot of restructuring around ideas of gender. So when we use gendered language to make the metaphor, I think it can lead to confusion and chaos, and needlessly so. I do believe that especially wise astrologers and like yourself, for instance, people who've been doing it for a long time, it's not nearly so dangerous because you can kind of read your person that you're reading for or understand your own thinking better. But for a lot of newer astrologers, and even when you're teaching a newer astrologer, there's so much that is bound up in these terms, right?
Mhm.
And in English, we don't have gendered grammar. So we don't have the thing of knowing that saying something is masculine doesn't mean it's male, right? Like I said, in French, a table is feminine, but no French person's like, well, that means that tables need to have breasts, like, right?
Right.
So like the same debates we have around language in the English language don't work in cultures that have gendered grammar. So missing out on that, we overemphasize how it works. Plus, we're monolingual in Anglophone society usually, which
Mhm.
leads to another constriction, another Saturnian influence on all this. So I basically recommend that we try and find more neutral terms, or at least the present time, to describe this energy we're trying to describe, and only use masculine and feminine as a metaphor when appropriate. Like make it a thoughtful thing rather
Interesting.
than just our go-to.
Well, so in the students at the Portland School of Astrology, where I worked for 7 years, would absolutely agree with you. They were asking us teachers, a lot of them were trans or, gender
Yeah,
fluid,
yeah,
and they were asking us to not use masculine and feminine for the signs. They wanted yin and yang. That was their
yeah.
solution. And so I think that you're definitely on the same train as a lot of gender deconstructionists at this point. But I like what you're saying that sometimes it's a thoughtful use of it. Like let's say
Right.
we're actually saying this chart is male-like because of this configuration, like Mars and Aries conjunct the moon in the first house or something. Like you could say, like, you're male-like because of this, and so I'm going to call it a masculine configuration. Like sometimes we could use it intentionally, but not just willy-nilly. We could say it's also very yang.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like I may be near the same spot, but I suspect it's for very different reasons. Like I want to be precise with language and I'm very interested in trying to find ways to make it as clear and concise as possible. So to me, the reason to avoid isn't because it's offensive or because it's wrong. It's because right now it's not an effective metaphor because of what we're all thinking about and doing as a society.
Hmm.
And within other groups and other languages and other cultures, it could be perfectly fine. And 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, it could be perfectly fine. But just in this current moment, it actually, I think it just carries too much baggage. Like
Interesting.
imagine if one of the signs was named Trump, right? Like that kind of thing. Like it wouldn't matter that it tied to something in the past. It would bring in so many connotations,
There's a
right?
word for that. There's a word for that when words conjure so many images in a person's mind that they get triggered. I can't remember the word for it, but like,
Right.
for example, like let's say I'm talking about race or something like that, and I use the word, I don't know, I use some word, even black, if I use that word, it
Mhm.
conjures a lot of negative pictures for some people, and in
Right.
that way causes tension. Whereas the
Right.
word African American causes less tension because it conjures different pictures. And I can't
Right.
remember what the word for that is, but that's a thing. So we can't call the sign one of the signs Trump right now because all we would see is pictures of Donald Trump. We wouldn't see that
Right.
sign. And I hear what you're saying there.
Right. So then that's my main like yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm trying to deconstruct gender, but like you had Leslie Francis on recently, right? She's a lovely woman from the same place as me, and one thing she said stuck out to me once was she was talking about how like when you look at a chart, you can't tell if it's a man or a woman, you can't tell if it's a cat or a dog, you can't tell if it's a company or a table, right? Like it's just a chart. It's a seed that's like this would be my interpretation. This chart is a seed that's planted in a particular soil. So that soil can be a male human being, right?
Mhm.
That soil can be a cat. And
Okay.
that's going to guide how the chart expresses, right?
Yeah.
So I think in the past there was a lot of trying to identify. Like I've read astrologers from the mid 20th century who claimed they could tell if someone was homosexual based on their chart. Now, I don't doubt that you can find within a chart people who are going to struggle finding societal acceptance of their sexuality. That seems likely to me. But whether or not that works itself out by someone being born, like being homosexual within a very heteronormative society, or whether it works out with them just having some other sort of sexuality or just not feeling accepted, even as a heterosexual person. Maybe it's a woman, in the 50s with a high sex drive and a polyamorous streak, right?
Right.
It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be homosexual.
Yeah. Have you heard of Ptolemy's four influences?
I have heard of them, but I'm not familiar with them.
So Ptolemy would say that there's four influences on a growing creature. There's genetics or seed. So,
Mhm.
is it a squash plant? Is it a watermelon? Is it a male seed? Is it a female seed, like
Mhm.
biologically? And then there's culture, climate, and then the chart. So it's like
Right,
we have that genetic piece. Is it a cat? Is it a dog? What's the chart layer? And so we actually parse that out in the Ptolemaic system,
right.
which I agree with.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. Like I'm very much there's more than just the chart. The chart shows a lot, and it's amazing like what people can do as they get farther along the predictive levels that can come out of it, understanding how much is faded, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, it's not all that there is. And it becomes obvious when you put in those terms, like, yeah, I could look at the chart for a birth of a cat or a birth of a human. It's the same bloody chart, but it means something very different. And even think about twins, right? Like I have a couple of aunties who are twins, and they have basically the same chart, and they are different human beings.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
seed got planted in slightly different soil,
Hmm.
and beyond that soil, there was, all the other influences on their life
Hmm.
that
Like,
eventually
have
changed
you
who
heard
they
of the
were.
epigenetics theory of astrology?
Oh, I haven't heard of the theory of astrology. I've heard of epigenetics, though.
So, like, epigenetics would be something that lays upon the gene. So it's like we have what you're saying is like different soils is like we could say that we have this genetic, like your aunt twins are different genetic structures, just a little bit or whatever, and then you have the chart laying upon the genetics, which epi means like upon. So it's like
Okay.
that's another way to kind of understand that
Mhm. Interesting.
holding together. Yeah. So,
Well,
what do you propose that we call the signs if we
so yeah,
don't?
I was just thinking to go there. So there's a few different bits of language I've found, like masculine has been given words like giving, active, outward, diurnal, or day, right? Whereas feminine seeing word as receiving, passive, inward, or nocturnal. And then we have, like I said, the cold and hot aspect of the elements, right? So all of those terms are I think helpful and more they're more base level, right? It gives us a scaffolding to build off of. So if you start with a client or even in your own head of thinking in one of those terms, and then you translate it further into say masculine or feminine, yin or yang, things like that, as appropriate, to me that makes sense. Most of those terms have little, they don't have much for a value judgment, right? Like masculine and feminine have a lot of value judgments baked into them, right? If you go, I can imagine, especially with a compressed chart like my own, I can imagine running into someone with a chart, like say a man who's got everything in water and earth. So is it helpful for me to tell that man that, oh wow, you're like all feminine energy? That might actually cause some problems, right?
Oh,
Might
interesting.
cause some confusion, might cause some self doubt or doubt of astrology, even, right? Like, well, I'm obviously a man. And this is another I welcome people who can show me something different, but looking at it statistically, if the chart did drive gender or even gender expression, right? So driving either of those, then we should see certain periods of time where most of the babies are, say, male or female, or where most of the male or female babies are turning out trans later on. Like we should see bundles like that every now and then. And honestly, astrologers, we're pattern masters, right? That's our entire thing is like noticing patterns. We get these charts and we read them and we understand them. And it's been a few decades now. I think those types of things would have been noticed
Hmm.
if the
I don't know
charts
that anyone's
drove
asked
gender
that
expression.
question though. I mean,
Well, but
I definitely think you're probably going to be an astrological professor someday, and well, as you're doing today. But yeah, I mean, I would love to see that question be asked by you.
well, that's what I'm saying. So some of these things would be seen even by the mundane world, right? So as you know, we do statistical studies all the time within psychology, and there is no evidence that there's certain times of year that there's been bundles like that. The distribution of gendered births is fairly even, you
So,
know?
but when we say that the birth is a chromosomal, it's sex. It's XX or XY or X
Yeah,
broken Y or XO is an option.
yeah.
XXY, XYY. But that the chart has its own gender. Basically, it's an essential gender, right? Like of, and I would say it has a cyclical fluctuating gender. I think you can have
Mhm.
multiple genders in one chart that fluctuate through the transits. I mean, but I think, that it wouldn't necessarily say there's going to be a certain amount of male seeds planted. It would just say that the seeds that were planted came out with an essence that was largely yang.
Well, that's where I say, like, then the other side of it is we should see at least mild statistical bumps in trans people as well, right?
Yes, I
And
agree.
I haven't seen any evidence of that, although obviously there's been a lot less research in those areas, so that could be possible.
Yeah, I love the
It
question
doesn't,
you're asking though.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, it could be possible. And I do like there are some good and powerful teachings around things like the divine masculine and the divine feminine. Right? It's notable to me that like when in talking to certain elders up here within the indigenous community, like they'll take this same idea. There is a divine masculine and divine feminine, but it's in all of us. Like we all have both in varying degrees of balance. But whatever it is, like we have a balance within us. And I think I heard you talk before about being like, what was it? Two thirds feminine, one third masculine. Was that how it
Yeah,
was?
my 28th degree is a total dude.
Right. So like that idea, like there is an element where like there's a balance. It doesn't have to be 50-50. It's not supposed to be for all of us, but each of us have a balance of those energies. And like I said, for me, it's not that we can't use these words, but they should be chosen. They shouldn't be the first one we go to. I really like the inward and outward because it's very neutral. And it's something that people can immediately picture because the more visually active we make this, the better, with
So
very
you're
little
saying
value
all
judgment.
water and earth are inward and all air and fire are outward?
Yeah, I mean, it's personally, I get really weird. I turn them into, X and negative X because I make some, oh, that's a bad marker. I'm going to switch that up. So I make them into X and negative X. And The reason for that is because I'm doing equations with them. So that's the other part of this is when you simplify concepts and try and get them down. Think of it like how hard it is to do math if you have to write out all the words, right? 15 times 5, but all in letters and alphabet is not near as easy as doing it, in just Arabic numerals.
Wow, I'm loving this.
So I do that, but that x and negative x is really useful for the math. It is not useful when you're trying to talk to a client or another astrologer because there's
So
no
you're saying like
imagery
you would
there.
give it a fire sign like X, like a positive,
Yes.
and then if it's a
So,
water sign, you give it a negative.
right. And
And you're
Earth's, so,
counting up how masculine or
right.
feminine the chart is.
So in that case, and then I would say that the wet and dry, so dry is Y and wet is negative Y. So therefore, Scorpio is negative X, negative Y, and fixed. And
Interesting.
those three dimensions are what makes the signs themselves. I do not yet have equations for the planets, but these equations, provided I don't have a precise way to measure how strong each of these elements are. But this is where thinking of the hot and cold dimension or the masculine and feminine dimension being the strongest by far predicts all the aspects that we have: squares, oppositions, trines, you name it. Because what happens is the X and Y dimensions, they attract each other when they're the same. So hot attracts hot, cold attracts cold, or inward attracts inward, or feminine attracts feminine, any of that, right? And wet attracts wet, and dry attracts dry. However, the modalities are where it gets interesting because modalities attract different. So cardinal attracts fixed and mutable, but cardinal actually repels cardinal a bit.
Okay.
Think of it all like magnetic attractions, right? And
Okay.
when you take that into your equation, you find all these interesting ways that the aspects come out because really the chart is not reality. It's a two-dimensional, it's a masterful tool. It's a two-dimensional representation of at least a three-dimensional reality, right?
Okay. Yeah, I would
That
agree
said,
that it's looking at 3D like chakras and aura and vectors and all that kind of thing.
at least 3D, right? So, and it does a great job of doing that, but still some things are lost within it. But it's based on an underlying math,
Okay.
right?
Hmm.
So that's what I'm trying to pull out here is what is the math it's based on?
Hmm. So where do you put cardinal fixed mutable in the equation?
Uh, so it's basically think of like the multiplying on each other, but in different ways, and that's what creates the aspects, right? So, for example, if you take something, it doesn't matter what prediction I make. If I go, so say something is X, Y, and the same modality. So two things are X and well, they actually couldn't be exactly the same because I would just actually that's a conjunct, which is a helpful thing to understand. So if it's X, Y, and cardinal, both things are that thing. They're going to be very attracted to each other, but with that slight bit of a pushing away from the modality. That's a conjunct. And remember what a trine is, the most attractive aspect in the chart, which is a trine is when X and Y are the same, but the modalities are different. And that right away you understand mathematically, if you're following where I'm going, how these how a conjunct is different from a trine. Does that
Interesting.
make sense?
Yeah, yeah, kind of. I mean, I would love to see a whole equation written out here.
So let's say we have one sign is X. Like I said, let's get rid. I have a tendency to go to the X and Y because it's the easiest way to do it, but that's not very understandable to people. So let's say we have Scorpio, right? And we don't even really need to know what the other one is, but let's say it's Cancer, right? Just for that. So they're both cold, they're both wet, but one is fixed and one is cardinal, right? So what that means is that they're drawn together in every dimension. Versus, let's say we go Scorpio again, but let's make the other one be Leo. and see what happens. Well, now we have a cold sign on one, but a hot on the other. So now they don't like each other. And then on one, we have a wet, and the other, we have a dry. So they again don't like each other. And they're both fixed, which again means they don't like each other. But what we end up with there is a square, but represented that where we can understand why is the square difficult? Because they're at odds the whole time. So again, if you imagine two magnets trying to come together at the same pole, they push so hard. Imagine the amount of force you have to get there to push them together,
Hmm.
right? The amount of energy it takes.
Hmm.
This can also point to, I think, why squares can be the most creative.
Hmm.
Creative in the idea of creating new things, right? New ideas, new material representations, right? Because the trine is very productive.
Hmm. Wow.
So whatever you're gonna do, the trine is gonna push it out, push it out, push it out, push it out. But it could be the same thing over and over and over. Really good if you're a bricklayer, not so great if you're a novelist. And well, I guess there's some novelists who have made a career of that though.
Hmm. Yeah, it
But a
totally.
guy like Stephen King, I would expect that not only would he have the trine, right? Although I'm not looking at his chart, and I've never looked at his chart, but I would expect things like a trine and squares, right? Someone who's very productive, but also very creative.
Hmm. Yeah. So is this helping you to really grow? I feel like you're like putting your like Einstein like layer on astrology mathematically, and it's helping you really grok, just the feel of all the aspects and modalities and how they, I mean, I really feel like you're in doing this analysis, you're really going to have gotten, what things feel like. And now, do you think that the viewers should learn your equations, or are these like for your
Mm-hmm.
own mind?
I would love people who want to test them. And because one of the things, for example, is that the fascinating bits is that some aspects, even though they're the same aspect, should be slightly different. It will be hard to measure because this cold hot dimension is so powerful. You can tell it both in how people treat it intuitively. The idea that we have a special word for hot and cold, this masculine and feminine, that got invented instead of just saying hot and cold elements, right?
Hmm.
Because it's such a powerful part of it. But we don't have we don't in general naturally refer to them as wet and dry, and we haven't created another term for that, right?
Hmm.
Some astrologers definitely know that, but it's certainly not something that people generally use when they're talking about it, especially to their clients,
Hmm.
is what I've noticed, right? And even the modalities, we understand them to some extent, but they simply don't have the same amount of power.
Hmm.
So part of the reason I'm pulling this apart is to understand it better. But my hope would be over time that we can actually dig in and try and figure out these precise bits of it. Like how much more powerful is that hot cold dimension than the others in terms of attracting it and repelling?
Hmm.
Is it twice as powerful? Is it 5 times as powerful?
Yeah,
Can't
interesting.
really tell.
I
I
want to
can't
see you
tell.
add some vector lines on here. Like how much, like how, if it's like Mars in Scorpio, is there like a vector line coming out of like how much energy is in Scorpio? Or, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure that your equations will get
Well,
really advanced.
and that's part of the problem with like I don't yet know why the planets are termed feminine and masculine exactly. Like it definitely seems true. It seems to work, but I'm not sure what the equation for the planets is,
Wow.
right? And I'm not sure if I could. Maybe it's not figurable out.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's all a system. What you're doing is systematizing things in a way, you're trying to find a system of it that works, systematically, not to overuse that word, but that works ubiquitously through all of the signs and things like that. And I think you're definitely on to something that it's definitely strengthening your muscles, on the astral layer. Have you ever heard of the term onopheric and cotaferic?
No.
So they're Greek words for all the fire and air signs are onopheric, which means carried upwards, and all of the earth and water are carried downwards, which it made me think of it. when you said outward and inward, like
Mhm.
earth and water are go kind of in and down, and air and fire go up and out is kind of, and that's a Greek term. So I think feel like that might be kind of something we
Yeah.
can use too.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it reminds me of that Roman idea too of the material versus the spiritual,
Hmm. Okay.
right? Like
Interesting.
just when I think down, I think, getting down to earth, right?
Okay.
Versus the spiritual. So yeah, I agree. That's interesting there too. Another interesting thing for people to think about is what isn't termed masculine or feminine within astrology. For example, the houses,
Okay.
right? The houses are very, very old, again, thousands of years old. Um, but they don't have a masculinity or femininity ascribed to them. It's not like, oh, the first house is masculine, the second house is femininity, feminine. They get their masculinity or femininity or hot or cold nature from the planets and within them and the signs that are on them.
Mm. Yeah, they're kind of neutral zones of space that get inhabited by a certain yin or yang quality.
Exactly, exactly, right. And then some other things, for example, we don't give aspects a particular quality there, right? We don't give the motion of the planets, so retrogrades, stationed, and direct, right?
Okay.
Right?
We could make the case that a square is more yang than a sextile is more yin. Um, it's, the square is more prodding and kind of instigating, and the sextile and trine are more placid and amenable.
Yeah, you could. The problem is that they do sometimes the way they act is in these other ways. And I haven't seen that there's like maybe you know better. I haven't seen that there's an agreement on that. I've seen it's rare for people to do that, and those who do, there's no agreement.
Well, and I do think in my old age, I have seen, trines between Mars and Saturn be act very badly or meanly, you know what I mean? Or,
Yeah.
sextiles between malefics or, it's like the planets and the aspect also kind of inform the thing. But
Well, that's where they get the inward outward bit. Like you could make a case, for example, with retrogrades versus direct, right? You could also make a case. I'm just saying that there's no broad agreement there. We don't have thousands of years compared to the signs and the planets of people saying this is what it is,
yeah.
right? We have at most people saying, well, maybe it's this.
Next time I want to look at Valence. Did he say that like Aries is masculine? Let me see. Let me see here.
Yeah.
Um, so he says the
There's
con
also minor objects. We shouldn't like asteroids, the centaurs. I haven't seen people really like, unlike the planets, the only modern objects that people have really gendered has been the planet, like the Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto. And even there, I have seen dispute on that, which would be to be expected. They're very modern. Neptune is less than a century discovered at this point.
yeah. Interesting. Yeah, Valence does say Aries is a masculine constellation, so he does say
Mhm.
that. Um, let's see if he says that about Taurus, um, being feminine. Um, this is a feminine sign. Yeah, so okay, so that went
Yeah.
way back. Um,
Yep.
okay.
Yeah. The signs definitely, like I said, I don't know if the ideas of the elements, if all the Greeks agreed on that. I've heard conflicting reports there.
Oh, interesting. Oh, I like what you're saying though. There's a lot in astrology in the schematic diagram that is not gendered, and that, it's just there's just a few elements that are gendered, but that kind of like permeates everything about the schematic, really.
Well, and like I said, I'm not convinced that anything is actually gendered. I use masculine and feminine because they're used commonly, and you need to understand what they mean when you read astrological works. Like you've done the translations all the way back to the Greeks. If you've learned more than one language, if you've lived in more than one culture, you understand that words that seem the same can mean very different things in different times and different places,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
right? So it's important to keep that in mind, and that's why, like, I don't really see gender within the chart. I do understand like the divine masculine, divine feminine, that kind of stuff, or like I said, certain people being accepted or feeling accepted in their gender expression and others not. You could be a cis man who feels very accepted as a masculine person in your society, and I could see that in your chart. or you could be a cis man where it's like you do not feel accepted at all.
Yeah,
And again, I can
and
see
I
that
know
in your chart.
trans people who feel very accepted in their gender and
Exactly.
pass really well, and then others who have more of the dysmorphia charts, and it's like you can be a cis man with dysmorphias of all kinds depending on the natal aspects and transits to them. I agree.
And that's what I think is main, like whether or not you feel accepted or not, regardless of your sexuality or your gender expression. I think that shows up in the chart because there's people will often talk about oppression of gay people, which is obviously true, but there are gay people who lived very successful and enjoyable lives and never really felt oppressed at the same times as most gay people did. And I
Yeah.
would like to me, I'd be like, I bet you it's in their chart that they were just going to be accepted within their society, and it didn't matter that they were gay.
Absolutely. What I've seen, and it's the same, it's so funny because Ricky Williams, who runs our culture and astrology class, whenever I bring up racism, he has such a positive mental attitude. Like he's basically unaffected by racism because of his chart. He has a Sun Jupiter conjunction. And so he's just like, what? It's fine. Like I have no problems with racism. Like, but he's like, racism is old and tired. And like, but that he has such a positive attitude that his spirit kicks his body's ass, basically. It's like, and it's like the trans people I know who are unaffected by trans oppression have these very lucky, joyful, triny, kitey charts where, it's like that even if somebody was oppressing them, their vibe is such as to be nonplussed, and I think you're absolutely onto something there.
Well, and it's when you mention Ricky Williams, that's interesting because I also have a very positive vibe and like in general, very positive experience of my reality. And yet I have had to notice racism closely because my hair will bring it out of people. I'll
Interesting.
get to know it won't bother me that much, right? Like it'll bother me in this like Sagittarian, this isn't just like how can people still be like this, right? But even as a white guy, I get to have this experience of like, huh, yeah, these little microaggressions really do friggin' irritate a person. I can see how someone would be annoyed. Like when people just come up and touch your hair without asking. It's kind of weird.
Okay. So you're kind of experiencing some of that because of your genetic vessel, but not necessarily your chart. Your chart layer is kind of it's not susceptible to oppressions, but your genetic layer is in this culture kind of susceptible to these microaggressions.
To some extent, and I suspect that like my chart makes it easy to handle, but I also suspect that my chart helps explain why those experiences are drawn to me, why I get to experience people who are racist in my life,
Hmm.
right? And acting in these disrespectful ways. Like
Yeah.
it gets drawn to me. It doesn't necessarily like feel this horrible thing, but I have to notice it and I have to feel compassion for those who deal with it on a much bigger way, right?
Yeah.
That's my interpretation of my chart and how it's is involved in this.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I remember dealing with a person who is not oppressed in a gender way, but they had a Saturn
Mhm.
square sun, and they would go through these transits to their Saturn square sun where they were so Eeyore and like life is horrible and like all this kind of stuff for no cultural reason at all. It was just this spiritual Saturn square sun thing.
Right.
And so it's interesting how there is oppression in the world, but it is mostly astrological. I mean,
Yeah.
not to say the
Well,
cultural layer isn't important, but we do focus on that astral layer.
yeah, I mean, we need to focus on the astral layer. And there's that part of me that's like, these things are real. The social level is real. Actually, one of the things that I think we also get wrong, we talk a lot about the big three, and we make the ascendant the most important thing on the chart, right? Ascendant. And everybody will look at this and go, there's the ascendant, right? But that's just the way we drew it. I could put the ascendant here or here or here. It's up to me where I put it. But because we start there and we read from left to right, right? It's a natural thing in our society. We always elevate the ascendant. I believe it also has something to do with like we're a very individualistic society. And even when astrologers acted in the past, they were often acting for the wealthy who would be most concerned about themselves, right? Like in general, would not everybody, obviously, but in general. However, even when you look at it, it's called the chart ruler, right? as if it rules all of this. It's the chart ruler. But no, it's the ascendant ruler. It rules one section because you also have a nadir, and you have a midheaven, and you have a descendant. And at least the descendant should be theoretically of the same power within the chart. Now, so how I try and do it is I look at the chart and I look at the angles and I start from the assumption that they're all equal and let the chart lead me to know if any of them have special import to the native, right? I mean, if you have a bunch of planets conjunct your midheaven, well, that's telling me where the actual most powerful angle is in your chart, right? Whereas someone who's got Sun conjunct the ascendant, well, yeah, that's
Mhm.
going to be really the ascendant is going to be a big part of it. But they're all related to each other. If your Sun is conjunct your ascendant, it's shining on your descendant at all times,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? There's an oppositional element there, which is also the same as like a full moon element going on with your descendant,
Mhm. Wait,
and
so
vice
let me ask you
versa.
a question. So, your proposal here that we don't use the words masculine and feminine, we use other words. I- Do what words you choose to use depend on the receiver of your reading?
Yes, that's all I'm really advocating is be thoughtful, right? So if you have, like, you're using the word yin yang, I wouldn't use it. I don't know enough about the culture it comes from. It would, for me, it would be a very vague term. And most of the people I'd be talking to, it wouldn't be helpful. But if for you, it's a very helpful term, if the people you're talking to or the way you're thinking in your own head makes it the most helpful, then that is what you should use. And the same with masculine and feminine, honestly. We should just keep in mind who we're talking to,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
I would advocate going to more neutral language and then building up from there,
Hmm.
right?
Like
Using the metaphor that works.
if we have a client who would be really triggered by those words, because they are maybe gender fluid or they have had to deconstruct gender a lot, like it doesn't conjure the same picture as, because words are literally codics to send a thought picture over to another person. So if I use the word masculine for somebody who's, genderqueer, like they're gonna see all these pictures that if we send it over to a cis man, they might just get a simple picture.
Oh, I wouldn't even say that. At this point, with gender, everybody has a political view on gender at this point in our society. It is a very tremendous political topic. That cis man, he has views on gender, tremendous ones.
Hmm.
Very
Okay.
likely. Not everybody, obviously, not everybody has this, but more likely than not, people have a strong opinion on gender. You don't need to be a feminist or someone who's trans to have these opinions. I mean, I've met plenty of guys who've never even had a kid, never been to college, never really thought about things, but man, do they have opinions on trans people, right? And what it means to be a woman.
Hmm. Okay.
So, like, if they've got, like, you never know who's coming into your office, right? Or whatever it may be. With everybody having such strong opinions right now, and there just being a lot of emotions around it,
Well, I feel
in
like
the
hot and
general
cold
vibe.
hot and cold are similarly complex. If you say the word
Yep.
your chart is hot, people are gonna be like, "Oh, you think I'm hot?" Like, or they're gonna be like, like I'm hot tempered, or I feel like any
Okay.
word can conjure, erroneous pictures.
Any word can. Some are more likely though. You'd have to think of that, right? Just like say, like I said, like any word can, but Trump means something different than pop. Like there can be different ways that these images come across. And that's where, like, as astrologers, we have to think both of how we're thinking about things and how people are hearing us, right? Like, to me, there's a tremendous listening level involved in our practice. If you use the words hot and cold, and yeah, somebody's getting confused about it, it's not helping them, then you got to switch it up,
Yeah, interesting.
right? And I just advocate starting with the most neutral term and then building from there as you build a rapport. If you've been practicing astrology with someone for 20 years, you don't need to change your method. You know that person, they know you. You're communicating very well. But for someone walking into your office for the first time, you simply don't know. So starting with the most neutral term that works in the language you're working in seems to me the safest route to start with.
Okay.
If you're running into someone who has a very balanced view of gender and is already familiar with the ideas of masculine and feminine energy and already generally believes that everybody has both within them, and there's no shame in being a woman with more masculine energy, for instance. Well, then obviously you can use that metaphor and those teachings and all that wisdom without any fear, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But someone who's 20, whether they're cis or trans, they walk in and you start using terminology like masculine and feminine, it can occlude things
Hmm.
more than clarifying.
Hmm. Well, it just you're reminding me that we what we do are is identity politics. People always think, gender is identity politics and race and all this stuff, but it's like astrology is identity politics. It's political to say anything like you are this, you are a Scorpio, and so you are this.
Mhm.
That's political to tell someone who they are, and then they get to speak back to it and say like, I don't agree, I don't. It's like so. I think we should always allow for that level of malleability and flexibility in our delineation of a person is to let them speak back to what we have spoken to them in any way that what we said rubbed them the wrong way. It's like we should allow for that.
Right. And certainly in some synastry, like you're going to have some come in. There's just going to be no way that you don't have some communicating conflict, right? Sometimes that's just what the synastry is going to lay out for you. Or sometimes this is the chart of the moment too.
Yeah.
But it's always a good idea to pull the synastry in the chart of the moment before you have a reading.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, all right, we have 5 minutes. Is there anything else in your theory that you want to bring up?
Uh, so yeah, I think I've gone over most of it. The ideas around, there's problems with this. We've talked about that, how using masculine and feminine bring up a lot of baggage, right? Given some examples of other terms we can use. Actually, I didn't talk much about day and night. It's actually a pretty good term. It can have some issues, but the great thing is that it introduces you to the idea of the day and night sex within the planets.
Mhm.
So it does build on that nicely as an astrologer when you're first learning. So that's certainly something to think about using when you're teaching new astrologers. I think the day and night delineations, especially of the planets, are a helpful one. And I've seen within my own practice that day and night sex and day and night charts that has a very strong interpretive value to it. So learning that early on is helpful. Um, Beyond that, yeah, I want people to think more about why we use the terms we use, right? Do we need to use masculine and feminine? That's the major thing I would like people to ask themselves. And if they really think we need to, I'd love to hear the argument for that.
Okay, well, maybe we can get some response videos. Do you think we need to use the terms masculine and feminine? If not, what are other terms? If so, why do you think so? And we'd love some responses in the comments or in any videos.
Mhm.
Now, Dizzy, I don't mean to change the subject, but you did such a good job here. I mean, I can't tell you how much you are an astrological professor in the making. Like, as a teacher and a producer, I'm like, this is the best show ever. Like, I love this. What other topics would you like to talk to us about?
Huh.
You can think of,
Well, there's so many that are interesting to me. So I think, yeah, it's something we'll have to work on. I'm really interested. I'm a student of psychology now. I was a construction worker for 20 years,
wow.
but now I'm a psychology student, and there's so many interesting aspects to the chart. I'm really interested in how we teach astrology to people. So I've been working on that, trying to come up with some super basic methodology to make it the best ever.
Would you,
I'm
would you
also
be, oh, go
I'm
ahead.
also developing a astrology party game. I'm really into I have Sun and Moon in the 11th house, and I'm very much into like how we can grow the community. And I actually found an astrology game at a thrift store while I was developing this. And I got another one given to me from an estate of unfortunately one of our founding members, Inga, she passed away last year.
Oh,
And yeah, she had an old astrology game in her basement, I guess.
wow.
So, but it's really I'm currently the interim secretary of the Edmonton Astrological Society. And so we're trying to grow that community. And I really love thinking about that. How can we grow a community as astrologers and work with each other and learn more? I'm very convinced that that's how we can really take these gifts we've been given. We live at such a wonderful and powerful time within the astrological community. I've only been studying this since last September, and I'm just blown away at how lucky I am to have access to what people like you and the people who came before you, like the Project Hindsight, all these translations of older texts, right, that we're able to share and understand and read. There's such a wealth of information as well as the technology of the modern age, right? What the telescopes of our space agencies are finding out there,
Mhm.
right? The ways we can have these computational programs that can do the work we used to have to do by hand, which by the way, that's another thing. I think we should still learn, at least learn how to to calculate a chart by hand. There are certain things that you understand when you do the chart by hand versus just generating it.
Oh, 100%. I'm a hand drawer, you know that. So it's like hand drawers are different than non-drawers. Like the kind of astrologer who can draw a schematic by hand is just it's like an architect who could draw a blueprint. I mean, it's just a different kind of architect. Well, I'm really interested in talking to you about psychology. Like we could do a series on um, like abnormal psychology, and it's the astral layer versus the label layer of like BPD, what might we could do something with
Well,
psychology and astrology.
and have you thought of like the aspects of human development represented through the houses? Because the house system is really a story of how humans develop. This is well, like, think about how, in general, the norm is that certain houses trine and square each other and sextile each other.
Hmm.
And if you think about how those house topics inform how a person grows, right? Like it's fascinating to me. I agree.
Well,
Like there's so many elements within astrology. You can take this abnormal psychology and look for those aspects, and also how to remediate. That's why I fell in love with your method. Is hearing you talk about remediation. It's very much how can we take what's going on, not ignore it, not pretend that every chart's perfect and every aspect's and like no, sometimes there's issues, and sometimes it's hard to remediate these things,
nice.
right? And you look
Well,
at that hard.
with your beautiful Mercury and just your voracious knowledge and inclination to teach, I know we have to go right now, but I will
Yeah.
challenge you to think of the next topic and let me know. We'll get you on the schedule because I really love this, and maybe we can have some of the other students from school in the room with us because I think having the more people hearing your stuff, the better.
Yeah.
This is
Well, I mean, you know what and there's other people too. Like I remember looking through your playlist and your episodes with Jail were really interesting. It's like, man, if we did a panel together, that'd be kind of
Oh
cool.
yeah, we could get you and Jael on the show together.
Yeah,
That would be
Jail,
rad. Okay,
right? Do
okay,
some panels and play around with some ideas. Like
okay.
imagine if you look at all your angles as having a ruler, and what does that change in your interpretations, right?
All right, well, we have to close
All
today,
right. Yeah, sorry.
but Dizzy, but
My brain will
Dizzy,
go on forever.
no, but Dizzy, let me know what you want to do next and we will get it on the schedule because I really, really thought this was phenomenal. And
Yeah,
I will
that's
see you
great.
soon.
See you soon.
All
Bye.
right, bye.